So the share today will once again deal with Inyona the Yoima. And in many shiurim I've been giving, I say, if Chazal teach us, kol oisik b'toras chatos kilu hikrav chatos, oisik b'toras oila kilu hikrav oila. In the new edition of Minchas Oshel ala Torah, I discussed at great length and I brought many sources. Kolu oisik is not only by kodshim, by karbanis, but all mitzvahs of Torah, and all those mitzvahs which one cannot perform. There are so many mitzvahs that one could perform only beveis hamikdash. There are mitzvahs only kohanim have, and others that leviim have. Kol oisik b'toras keilu oso. So when we deal with the most grave questions in Torah about pikuach nefesh, about war, Kodesh Baruch Hu should help. It should be considered as if, the siyata d'shmaya, as if we are waging war, and the schus of Torah, Kodesh Baruch Hu should be with us. So the question we will be discussing today is fundamentally about pidyon shivuyim. One of the tragic consequences of this present war is the fact that more than 200 Yidden are hostage in the hands of our terrible, brutal, barbaric enemies. Never before that we have a situation like this. So in the past, we had one soldier in captivity, but more than 200 people are in enemy hands. And even though nobody is dealing with this publicly, but we will be discussing the halachic approach. And I discussed this many times in the past, a few years ago when the Israeli government released hundreds of terrorists to bring one soldier home, Gilad Shlit. So let's revisit this question. So the fundamental sugya is in Gittin Daf Mem Hey in the Mishnah. Ein poide miseshuim yoisa mikedei de mehem. And this halacha deals with pidyon shivuyim. When a Jew is in custody by the non-Jews, and Jews are the people that always cared for each other more than anyone else in the world. And the Mishnah says, and there's an aboy in the Gemara, two different interpretations. What does tikkun oila mean? Dochke de tzibura or de la ligravu veleisu? Does it mean that there are only limited public funds? And if you will pay a horrendous price, more than a reasonable price, then that will encourage them to take more Jews into captivity, and the tzibur won't be able to pay that price. We have other needs. We need to care for the aniyim and the avirim and Talmud Torah and Achmas Skala. Or maybe, is it not mishum doche de tzibura, but we don't want to encourage the goyim to snatch more Jews away from their homes. And if they will be making a lot of money, that will encourage them to do it again. Then afkamina would be, well, we don't need any public funds. The family is willing to pay whatever the goyim asked for. If it's mishum doche de tzibura, we won't intervene. Let the family pay whatever they wish to get their loved ones home. If it's at the Kona de la Ligra of Evelaisa, we're afraid that they will be encouraged to do it again, then we will prevent the family from doing so. Both the Rambam, Perek Ches, Matnas Aniyim, Halacha Yud Beis, and the Shulchan Aruch, Semination Beis, Yoredei Sif, Dalet Sif Hey, asking in accordance with the opinion de la Ligravu Velaisu. So let's have a look at the Shulchan Aruch, Sif Hey. סעיף ד' actually, אין פוידם עשר שבועים יויסם כדי דמיהם משום תיקן ועולם שלוי יהיו האויבים מויסם עצמם עליהם לשבותם. אבל לא אדם יוכל לבדוס עצמו בכל מה שיש. Now there are exceptions, as the Shulchan Aruch writes. If a person is a great Talmid Chacham, or even he's not a great Talmid Chacham yet, but he's a young scholar and Ilui, Talmid Chorev ve'efshar sheyeh Odom Gadol poidem moiseh b'domim merubim. What is this halacha based on? Tosfos Daf Mem Hey ask from a different sugya Daf Nun Ches, and most of us remember the other sugya from Tisha B'Av. We learned the sugya of Kamza and Bar Kamza. And the Gemara in Gittin Daf Nun Ches of Adalef tells the story of Yeshua ben Chananya, who was notified there's a young boy in captivity in the Romans' jail, in the Roman dungeon. And he seems to be a wonderful boy. And Yeshua ben Chananya goes to visit him by the Romans. And Yeshua ben Chananya asks, and that young boy cries out from behind bars. And Yeshua ben Chananya swears, and Tosfos asks, how does it fit in with the Mishnah? So there are three terusim in Tosfos, Daf Mem Hey and Daf Nun Ches. Let's have a look at the Tosfos Daf Nun Ches, the page we are on right now. So Tosfos writes, Lefi shehayu muflag b'chachma, and so Tosfos Daf Mem Hey writes, and once again in Daf Nun Ches, mishum de muflag b'chachma hayu. But Tosfos also writes the first teretz. Let's go back to Daf. Inami b'shas chor ben Abayis lo shayech de lo ligrevu. Daf Nun Ches Tosfos writes, when there's sekonas nefashos, it's a different rule. So we have three terutzim in Tosfos. Ki ikes sekonas nefashos, we pay any price to save a person from death. Even though in Hilchos Tzedakah we learned that every pidyon shvuyim is defined as pikuach nefesh, but obviously there are different levels in sekana. So one teretz in Tosfos is b'shas echorim there was sekonas nefashos, and therefore we pay any price. The other teretz that we found both Daf Mem Hey and Daf Nun Ches is Talmid Chacham Shani, and Daf Mem Hey Tosfos writes b'shas echorim. This rule doesn't apply. Sosam v'loy perish. Why would shas echorim be different? One could argue, in the times of Chorban, maybe we need to take into consideration the morale of the people. People were devastated, people were depressed. There was a real acute problem of motivating people to live, to fight. But both the Ramban and the Meiri offer a different explanation. The Ramban says, Kulam holchu b'shevi, and the Meiri explains the same. In days of peace, we don't want to pay a horrendous price because that'll encourage the goyim to take more people into custody. But in the days of Chog, we were at their mercy anyway, and they did what they wanted. They killed, they rampaged, they tortured us, and they took anybody into Shevi at their own will, and therefore the rule applies. There is no chashash of ligravo velaiso, and we do our best to save as many as we can. If we go back to the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch do not differentiate between sakana or no sakana. And they both write that Talmud Chacham has a different din. So we have the Rambam, Perek Chesed Chud Beis, ein points is shul music de the man shim to kan wolem shloya oivem roit from achreim lishboisam. And therefore the Rambam says, but if you're dealing with the Talmud Chacham, then we could even be yoisim kedei the name and the Shulchan Aruch. We find the same. Throughout the ages, this was a very, very relevant question. Shuvas Maram Lublin Sementesvov. And there was a Jewish youngster who was Oiver Aver and Malchus. And we won't go into details exactly what was his crime. But he committed a crime being with a Muslim woman, and he was in jail, and his life was in danger. And the Maram Lublin was asked, do we raise money, a horrendous sum, to bring him out? And the Maram Lublin says no. He rejects the teretz of Toises B'Mokam Sakor Neshani, and the Maram Lublin quotes the Shulchan Aruch, the only reason, the only exception we have is a Talmud Chacham. And the Maram Lublin writes, it really makes no difference that he is to blame. Still, we will not take him out of jail paying a horrendous sum, which is unreasonable. And the Maram Lublin also quotes Shuvas Mahari violence in Kuf Mem Ches. Pischei Tshuva on the spot quotes the Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel says, Shomati B'Shem Reb Shmuel Kaidenhofer was one of the greatest Gedolim in that era. That he is Choylek HaMaram Lublin, and he says, well, there's another teretz and Tosfos, B'Mokam Sakana. We do go out of our way and pay any price because it's Pikuach Nefesh. And we disregard monetary issues when we're dealing with Pikuach Nefesh. So this was a machlokes between the greatest poskim hundreds of years ago, going back almost 500 years. 100 years later, we find an additional tshuva in Knesset Yechezkel, once again dealing with a Jewish person that committed a crime, and therefore he is in prison. And he totally agrees with the Maram Lublin and disagrees with the Beis Hillel. And he paskins, even when a Jew's life is in sakana, the halacha still applies. Ein toidim eseshavon yoser mikedei demeim. Which brings us to the famous story of the Maharam Rotenburg. The Maharam Rotenburg in his era was the greatest posek and the greatest teacher in Ashkenaz in Germany, going back 900 years. And that was a terrible time in our tortured history in Europe. The Christians were Reidevin, they killed, and they tried to force Jews to convert to Christianity. And that was 200 years before the Spanish Inquisition. That was Germany. We don't know exactly why the Maharam Rotenburg was taken into custody. There are different versions, different opinions, different stories. But the fact is that two of his greatest Talmidim were murdered by the Christians, Hagos Maimonides and the Mordechai. We learn their Torah every day, but not everybody is aware of this part of our painful history. The Mordechai and the Maharam Rotenburg were murdered, and that is when the Rosh fled. He ran away, he left Germany, and he moved to Spain. And he moved to Tulatula, which today is known as Toledo. And then something unprecedented happened in the Mesoides of Halacha. The Rosh was an Ashkenazi, he was a Talmud of Maharam Rotenburg. And he arrived in Spain, he briefly met the Rashba. The Rashba was the leader of Sephardi Jewry in Spain, and he was in Barcelona. And the Ran was extremely inspired and inspired from this young Ashkenazi scholar. When the Rashba passed away, the Rashba became the undisputed Poisek and leader of Sephardi Jewry, even though he was an Ashkenazi, a Talmud of Maram Rothenburg. So the Rosh fled Germany and he settled in Toledo. So Maram Rothenburg was in jail in the Einsheim fortress. And the Goyim demanded a ransom and they were willing to free him. And Maram Rothenburg said no. And he asked his Talmidim to raise the money because he was 7 years in prison and he died in prison. And then they asked for money to free his body. The Shema Gedolim Dechida has a very lengthy biography of Maram Rothenburg and Sefer Shem Gedolim. And he writes that Maram Rothenburg was many months, I think it was from Chodesh Iyar to Chodesh Adar, almost a year after his demise. His body was by the Goy. Took almost a year to raise the money and to free his body lekvura. Maram the Chidu also quotes the Seder Adoiris. The Seder Adoiris has his version of the story. And then the Chidu brings an amazing climax to the story. There was a rich person in Nugget that donated the money to redeem Maram Rothenburg's body and to bring him to Kevi Yisrael. And the Maram Rothenburg came to him in a dream. And he said, he thanked him for bringing his body to Kevi Yisrael. And he said, Mina Shemayim, they offer him one of two options. Either a promise that he and his oldest descendants will be rich, or he will pass away shortly and he will be Zoicha L'chaye Ha'olam Haba. And he preferred to be Zoicha Ha'olam Haba. And he passed away shortly. And then the dream was he should be buried next to Maram Rothenburg. I visited the cave of Maram Rothenburg when I was in Worms in Germany. I don't know who was buried next to him because the other kvarim there aren't really intact. But the Marshal in Yam Shel Shloimo, Gittin Perek Dalet Siman Samach Vav, wonders if the Shulchan Aruch paskins that a Talmud Chochem should be redeemed for any price, the Maram Rothenburg was the Gadol Hador. So why did he paskin Ein Poidnas Shuvuim Yoisem Mikidei Demeim? And then the Marshal says, but maybe the Maram Rothenburg was such an onav that he didn't consider himself to be a Gadol. But still, why didn't they agree they should bring him out for Bittul Torah? The Maram Rothenburg had the greatest Talmidim in the world. The Rosh, Maram Rothenburg, they were all his Talmidim, the Mordechai. And what about Bittul Torah? So the Marshal writes, when the Goyim have a Talmud Chacham in custody, they probably aren't aware who this person they have. And therefore we go out of our way and will pay any price to bring him out. But those that lacked that Maram Rothenburg were very well aware whom they have. And that is why they took him, because he was the Gadol Hador. So Maram Rothenburg figured if they're going to pay a price to have him out, then all the Gedolim of the generation will be in danger. And that's an amazing svara of the Marshal. Yes, to get a Talmud Chochem out of jail, we pay any price. Because Klal Yisrael needs Gedolim, Klal Yisrael needs teachers, Klal Yisrael needs giants. Those are the ones that keep us going. They are Einei Ho'eda. But that is when the Goyim aren't aware why we are willing to pay this price. But in the case of Meram Arotomeg, they knew. And they were aware they were going to pay any price because he's the God Lador. And Meram Arotomeg was afraid that he's jeopardizing and putting all the other Gedolim in danger. So that's the story of Meram Arotomeg. But Halacha L'Maisa, what is significant is the Amsha Shlomo writes, our minig is to pay Yoisem Kedei Demeim. And the Radbaz writes the same. Chuvas Radbaz Chelak Aleph Siman Men. And the Radbaz tries to explain why. But they do write the minig is to pay Yoisem Kedei Demeim. I want to make a point, and I think this entire sugya is not really entirely relevant when we are dealing with freeing hostages. And I want to explain why. In days of yore, whether it's the Mishnah or the Gemara, the story of Meram Arotomeg, it was all about money. It was all about money. They took Jews into custody because they demanded a ransom. The Meram Arotomeg wasn't tortured in prison. He actually died a natural death, meis al mitasei. He was in custody because the Goyim wanted money. And Chazal were concerned, if we're going to pay any price, it's going to happen again and again and again. We are dealing with a totally different situation. We're dealing, the Goyim don't want money. They are oivim benefesh. They are barbarians. They want to free terrorists. So for so many different reasons, ein ledamos. That very same Mishnah, the very same sugya, Gittin Daf Mem Hey, also says ein mavrichen es shvuyim mipnei tikkun u'olam, which means we do not free those that were taken into captivity. We will not initiate the commando raid. We won't even break open their cell. And why is that? Because we don't want the Goyim to be crueler or give harsher treatment to the other Jews that might be in custody. So if we apply this Mishnah to the present day situation, we would need to paskin, you leave those Jews by the Hamas. Don't try to free them with any military operation. Don't give them what they ask. So what is the other option? Let those people be tortured and killed and murdered by the Hamas. So what I'm trying to explain, for many reasons, this is a totally different halacha. First of all, how do we define Kedei Demeim? The Radbaz deals with this question. L'chayr, the times of the Mishnah, Kedei Demeim means how much is the Eved worth? People bought slaves. So if a Jew is taken into custody, it depends how old he is. Is he a young and strong man? Is he an old man? What's his price tag to sell in the slave market? In American history, slaves were sold down the Mississippi. If anybody of you knows, I don't know whether you read Uncle Tom's Cabin or American literature about the world of slaves. And so the Radbaz asks, how do we define Kedei Demeim? In our time, there is no longer a slave market. The Maram Lublin in his days in Poland, they didn't say slaves. So the Radbaz and others say, well, we need to check how much do you pay for a slave in those distant lands where they do sell slaves. So how does one define Kedei Demeim? I think Kedei Demeim is, what is reasonable? What do the Goyim usually ask for when they have a Jew in custody? But in our day and age, it's no longer about money. So what does Kedei Demeim mean? Most other countries, America and Russia and others, when they trade prisoners, It's usually 1-for-1. But the Arabs take advantage of the Jewish heart. We freed almost 1,000 terrorists for one person for Gilad Shalit, and it happened many times in the past. So I want to briefly summarize the difference between our dilemma and all the other questions in days of yore. From the Mishnah to the Gemara to the Shulchan Aruch to the Abbas, Maram Lublin, Marshal, going all the way down to the Knesset Yecheskel 300 years ago. It was always about money. It was never our enemies that would torture and kill. And therefore, it's a different question. And another difference is today we're dealing with a sovereign state. Sovereign state might have different considerations. And many times when I am asked questions that we need to deal with a sovereign state running a mamlocha, I say, since the days of Shlomo HaMelech, we didn't have these dilemmas. So I deal a lot with questions from the police force. Just yesterday night, the chief rabbi of the police was with his entire team sat at this very table I am sitting right now. We dealt with very tough questions in times of war. And I say, since the days of Shlomo HaMelech, we didn't really have running country. Even Bisman Bayesheni, the Romans ran this country and they were in charge. We only had a certain level of autonomy. It wasn't really us running the show. The last time we actually run a sovereign state was in the days of Shlomo HaMelech, and we don't have Shalas Tshuvas Shlomo Melech Yisrael. Neither do we have Shalas Tshuvas David Melech Yisrael. And we have very few sources in Shas, because in the days of the Mishnah and the Gemara, we no longer were in charge of a Malchus. And a Malchus legitimately has other considerations. It is important for the morale of the army. Soldiers should know, if I will be taken into custody, my country will do everything in their power to bring me home. That gives them motivation, that gives them courage, and a soldier needs to know, I will be brought home. So there are many chilukim between what we need to deal with in our present times and all the sources. In the past, it was never our arch enemies, and it was all about money. And the people that were in custody, it was sad, it was tragic, but they weren't tortured and they weren't killed and they weren't murdered. And on the contrary, money is only money. But when you release terrorists, tragically, most of the terrorists released in the past went back to terrorist activities. So we saved one soldier, but we paid probably a price with hundreds of others. So this would be once again an interesting halacha question. Pikuach nefesh, which is immediate, right here and now, saving one life, but we might be putting many other lives in danger down the road. What would the halacha be? So this is a totally separate discussion. So there are many considerations to be taken into account. Maybe one of the most important tshuvas written is a tshuva, a very lengthy tshuva written by Hagon Rabbi Yosef, Yabia Omer Chelik Yud Choshe Mishpatzin and above. And Rabbi deals with the Entebbe raid. And it is interesting, Rabbi writes that he and a group of the greatest Gedolim came together at the time. And they were Yabia Omer, Shalash Tshuvas Chelik Yud Choshe Mishpatzin above, a very lengthy tshuva. And he writes that he got together, and I think the government asked for a rabbinical opinion. And he got together with Maronan V'Rabbanan, Rabbi Yosef, Reb Shimon Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Tzalal Sholti, Rabbi Eliezer Goldschmidt, and Rav Ovadia. Those were some of the greatest Gedolei Yerushalayim, some of the Choshev Dayanim in Yerushalayim. And they decided to give the government a green light to negotiate. And if the government decides to free prisoners, they should do so. And then Rav Yevadi writes, when they were still in the middle of their deliberations and discussions, the prime minister notified them that the Israeli forces went down to Entebbe, as we all know, and miraculously, Nissim and Aflois freed more than 100 hostages. 2 Jews paid with their lives. 1 civilian and 1 officer, Yoni Netanyahu, prime minister's brother. But they freed more than 100. And Rav Avadia writes at the very last paragraph of this lengthy tshuva, if you could scroll to the end of this tshuva, it's about 20 big pages, the very last paragraph. And he writes with this beautiful lashon, because Rav Avadia has such an amazing control of Lashon Kodesh, and he writes so beautifully. I just want to read this paragraph. והנה באסף ראש הים גדול התורה בנויס הזה מבחינת ההלכה, ותוך כדי הדיונים שהסערו בצדדי ההלכה, הגיע ראש הממשלה מר יצחק רבין, זכרנו לברכה, אלינו ובישר לנו את הבשורה המרנינה, שכבר הצליחו אנשי צה"ל לחסל את המחבלים הראשון ואת עוזריהם באוגנדה, ולשחרר את מעט החטופים היהודים, והם בדרך לארץ ישראל. And then Rav Avadia writes, Tehilois le'el yisborach asher higdal chazdoi v'niflois v'imono ro kalaf siyosas yeshuas elokenu v'chol umes oilam heimu ro kein tamo v'shtoimam al-boras Yisrael menesholem karo maro yizgevoro v'higdilu la'asois v'ezes Hashem yisborach la'atzel v'kuchem le'moves והביאום ליסור ברינו ושמחה סוילם על ראשם, כי אין מצל להשם להושיע ברב ובמעד. בורך פוידה מצל, כי גובר עלינו חסדוי ואמס השם לעולם. Hallelujah, בורך המקדש שמוי ברבים. And this is such a beautiful paragraph, full of emunah in betochen, and thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for nisim and benefits. So my conclusion is, this is a totally different situation. And whatever, it is really for governments and for armies to decide. So we do have halachic guidelines, the importance of pikuach nefesh, doing everything to save and to salvage. And I think that the chashash of freeing hundreds of terrorists who will once again engage in terror is probably the most important consideration. Right now, we are confronted with an unbearable situation. It's not 1 or 2 people, it's more than 200 people. Children, babies, elderly. So I think we need to do everything to try to bring them home. On the other hand, we need to do everything to destroy our enemies and to see to it that such a horrific catastrophe and tragedy should never happen again. So we could only lift our eyes to the heavens and daven to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Kodesh Baruch Hu is a kerachum v'chanu. We don't know how. Nobody knows what to expect in this war. And a Kodesh Baruch Hu b'chasodov hamerubim should bring all his children home safely. Kodesh Baruch Hu should bring them all home, l'chaim, v'lesimcha, v'leshalom. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give siyata d'shmaya to all the soldiers that are moiser nefesh. I quoted a few times this week Reb Chaim Shmulevitz. Hagon Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, one of the greatest teachers of Torah of our time. In Sichas Musar, a shmuz that he said, Erev Chag HaSukkos Tovshin Lamed Daled, that was right in the midst of Malchemes Yom Kippurim. And he says, those young soldiers that are moiser nefesh, they put their lives in danger to save other Yidden, are like Harugei Lud, that the Gemara in Tanis describes, who sacrificed their lives to save Yidden. Ve'ein kol bria yochal lamoid b'mchitzoson, says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz. They're so high up in Shomayim. Ein kol bria yochel lamed b'mchitzosam. And Reb Chaim says, Ein gevul, there is no limit, and our chiyuv to daven for them. So please daven and learn, not only for the soldiers, but for kol yoshvei eretz kodshenu. This is our war. It's not the war of the IDF. It's the war of kol yoshvei eretz Yisrael. It's the war of the Jews in the entire world. These are enemies of Hashem. These are enemies that say, Lechu v'nakshina megoy v'lo yezoch Hashem Yisrael oid. It is our war. So you in America, please daven for us, learn for us. We need Torah and we need tefillas. In my shiur, we say 3 Perkei Tehillim after every tefillah. Perek Chof, Yanchu Hashem b'Yeritzara, Kuf Lamed Memamakim Korosicha Hashem. These 2 prokim are general prokim that we always say b'Shas Tzara. But I also asked in my shul and many other shuls that every day we should say Pei Gimel. Pei Gimel is the only Perek in Tehillim that deals specifically with war. When the enemies of Israel, when the enemies of Klal Yisrael, Nisanechu Nasu Roish, and this happened, Simchas Torah, Nisanechu Nasu Roish. And they were successful. And they say, Lechu v'nachina megoy v'lo yezoch Hashem Yisrael oid. What happened, Simchas Torah, is such an awful tragedy. I paid some shiva visits to tzaddikim who lost their children. And today, I became acquainted with such a tragic story. A 90-year-old woman, a Holocaust survivor, was left alone. Her children and grandchildren murdered brutally in one of the kibbutzim in the south, Simchas Torah. She escaped the Germans, she escaped the Nazis to come to Eretz Yisrael, only to have her family destroyed, an entire family, in the same fashion as the Germans did, in the same fashion. Same barbarians who would believe in Eretz Yisrael with our own army that this would ever happen again. So it's a terrible midas adin, and we should daven and learn. The entire Jewish world is learning and davening. Shakadosh Baruch Hu ya'ala mikisei adin v'yeshev al kisei harachamim. Shakadosh Baruch Hu yarachem oleinu al pleitas beis sofreinu. And we should only be zeicha to the Seiras Torahs. Kodesh Baruch Hu yadbir oiveinu tachatenu. Shemish Melchama. Kodesh Baruch Hu should be the Jewish soldiers that are moise nefesh, and we should be zeicha v'notati shalom ba'oretz v'simchas olam liyosheveyo. My dear friends, we should always be mevasa b'seiras torahs, yeshuos v'nachamos. Kol tov.